it's been 18 years since I was wounded in combat. And people, and I've spent, I don't know, 12 or 15 years of that in therapy. And people kind of ask, well, are you better yet? Like, when are you going to be done with that?
Welcome back to 10,000 Heroes. Remember, it's not a podcast. It's a hero generation machine. So this episode is my second conversation with Casey Jourdan, who hosts the Pursuit of Evolution podcast. But more importantly for me, Casey is real. If you heard our first interview with her, you know that she suffered. She lived through war. She experienced confusion, depression, isolation, loss, infertility, shame. She's been through it. And she remains accepting, positive, strong, and ultimately very helpful for others. So today we went through her 8 rules of life, or that's what I call it at least. And there's some mindset shifts in there. There's some action steps. And there's some self-acceptance waiting at the bottom of well for all of us, of course. So once again, thank you to Casey for just being yourself and for coming on the show. And let's jump in. Well, I'm very, very excited to have you back on the show because at the end of our last interview, you dropped this little tantalizing nugget of your personal eightfold path, is how I see it. And I'd love to take some time and just explore that. And so maybe one way we could do that is if you could give the overview, just the 8 items to like reframe it in everyone's mind. Mm-hmm. And then we'll go into what each of those means for you.
Yeah. So it's funny because I have to confess. So after this 8-part piece thing is a thing that's constantly like, I'm constantly working at it and looking at it again. And as I have conversations with people, and since we talked, which was 2 weeks ago, I had an epiphany and I realized one of the 8 parts I've always had mixed feelings about. And I had an epiphany and I realized I was focusing on the wrong thing. So there's been a shuffle since the last time we talked about this. Obviously the pursuit of evolution is my thing. It's my podcast show. It's kind of the name I have given this 8 things. So these 8 things are going to keep evolving too. So that's how I roll. So all of that said, the 8 things, so it starts out with kind of 3 mindset shifts, which is owning your own story. There's no one right way to do anything in this life, and embracing your strengths and balancing your weaknesses. And then there's kind of 4 actions.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to recap each of those just for my own learning. So it starts with 3 mindset shifts. One is embracing your own story. The second is there's no one right way to do life. And the third is embracing your strengths and your weaknesses.
Yes. Balancing your weaknesses, embracing your strengths and balancing your weaknesses.
Embracing your strengths and balancing your weaknesses. Okay. So those are the 3 mindset shifts it starts with.
Yep. And then there's kind of 4 actions, and these actions both can help with these mindset shifts. And they're kind of the things that I see that keep coming up as ways of helping navigate change. And like, how do I tackle this giant thing? Like, look at these 4, I keep calling them steps, but that implies that they're in a logical order. They're 4 practices that can happen at the same time. They can happen one after another. So the 4 actions are baby steps, boundaries, one which I call just face it, and then face it again. And then the last one is to quit more stuff.
Okay. Baby steps, boundaries, face it and face it again, and quit more stuff. I like these practices. Yeah. Awesome.
And then it rounds out, the 8th part is kind of a where do you go from here with it? And it's to never stop learning and growing. And it's a reminder that all of those things and this entire process, this is the reason it's the pursuit of evolution, not achieving evolution, this is a constant, a never-ending process that we're going to keep learning and growing and building new tools through all of these practices and mindsets.
Yeah, fantastic. It's very thematic, and it's a little bit fractal, that like one of the 8 is that you never stop learning, you never stop doing the other ones.
Yep.
All right, great. So maybe let's dive into the mindset shifts and start with the first one.
Yeah. So I think one of the keys, so whether we're talking about, to like set the scene a little bit, life-changing decision of because I talk about a lot of the times when I'm talking about stuff, I'm talking about these kind of pivotal moments in life. And so whether that's a decision to quit a career, get a divorce, come out as LGBTQ, like something where you like realize this is your truth and now I have to put it in action. And then this can also apply to things where like death of a loved one. My husband and I ended up childless, obviously not by choice. After a lot of infertility treatments, we made this decision to stop. So those kinds of things that happen to us. And I think one of the key first big things that we've got to talk about is owning our story. And this is a process of letting go of shames, shoulds, guilt, expectation, and just let the story be. And owning that story can be, and I encourage people to start taking it into a literal sense of talk about it at whatever level you're comfortable with. So some people that's starting with a journal and then burning that page because they don't even want to keep the piece of paper in the room. Some people that's telling your pet because they can't tell anybody, into telling a therapist, talking with your best friends. The first time I ever talked about owning your story, I was on stage for my TEDx talk, owning part of my story that I had never talked about publicly, that actually my husband didn't even know, and he was in the audience. And it was like, people are like, I can't own my story like that. And I'm like, owning your story is not about getting on stage, announcing it to the world, writing a book. It's about letting yourself say the words to yourself without judgment, without shame, without guilt. This is what happened to me. This is what I'm going through, as objectively as possible.
Okay. And what unlocks, what transforms, what happens as a result of that, of doing that successfully?
One of the big ones is taking away those judgments and shames. As a society, we get so many messages about who we're supposed to be and what things are supposed to look like, and gets wrapped up then in our decision making and our grief processes. And so like for us with the childlessness, everybody in the infertility world is always talking about don't give up, don't give up. And we'll get to this later, but like quitting was the best thing I ever did. Like infertility treatments are incredibly demanding on your body, your finances, your marriage. And everyone was telling me to go, don't give up. And I felt like a failure. And I felt shame about wanting to stop trying to have kids. And when I just let the story be that science didn't work in our favor, we're infertile, that's neither of our faults, and stopping is right for us, all of a sudden a lot of the guilt and shame melted away, and it was so much easier to make decisions about what to do next.
Yeah, that's just like layers of guilt, right? Because I imagine at the first level, just biologically not being able to have kids probably has a whole trip that comes with it. Like we're always being told that our sole purpose is to procreate biologically, like from evolutionary perspective. And then you add this whole other cultural thing on top of it of, well, now you have science. All you have to do is persevere and you can achieve this goal and pay a bunch of money. And so never give up. Okay. And so, yeah, you outline this continuum of like writing in the journal and burning it all the way to speaking on stage. These are different ways of owning your story. What if it's hard to get to the next level? What is the mechanism by which I go from only being able to write in my journal and burn it to talking to my pet? Or is it fine to just stay at one level in that continuum?
Two answers. It's fine to stay at one level in the continuum. There's no, I'm going to jump to step 2 for a second. Like there's no right answer. There's some people who their grief is so overwhelming that it's just learning to hold space for that story and not having to worry about moving beyond that story. Like that usually comes, but we don't have to force it. That said, people who are trying to be proactive, who aren't happy with where they're at and want to create that change and want to intentionally navigate whatever the thing is that's going on, this is kind of where this is like this. So like, I haven't figured out a good model for this whole pursuit of evolution thing yet. Cause like I said, all the things happen all at once and tie back to each other. So this is where that like face it and face it again step comes in, is keep writing about it in your journal and keep burning the page. It's a little bit like exposure therapy. if you talk about the same thing over and over and over enough times, our brain literally learns how to reprocess things, and it stops becoming such an emotional reaction each time you tell the story. And as you can discharge from that emotion, then you can take that next step becomes easier or becomes more logical. And so that's where we're kind of like, if it means 10 years of every day you write the story in a journal, tear the page out and burn it, maybe on, 10 years in a day, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm ready to talk to a therapist and see what's next. But we have to let ourselves just be with that story before we can force anything else.
And that's part of the lack of judgment, is not enforcing a timeline, just being patient with oneself.
Exactly. Yep.
And for you, since you're so open to talking about this, where are you in this journey of owning your story? Do you feel like you're where you want to be, or are you still trying to push it a little bit? Are there parts that are inaccessible to you, or that you still have judgment about?
All of it. None of this is linear, which makes it so fun to talk about. I have a very strong sense of my story, of where I fall in my story. I have found a lot of power in owning my story from day one. So a lot of times, my experience being the veteran community and the childless community, there's a lot of shame about veterans of PTSD. There's a lot of shame about being an infertile woman in especially American society. I talked about it from day one. The day we found out we had to go see an infertility doctor, I was honest with my friends about what was going on. And so I've owned my story through the whole process, which in and of itself is this huge, powerful resource, in my opinion. And so it's easier. The childlessness has been easier because I already had learned the power of owning my story. And I've done that since day one. It took me a lot of years to unpack being a disabled combat veteran, because after I was wounded and after I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, I still spent 3 more years in the military. And I essentially had to hide that from my chain of command and from the guys I worked with. And so then I had 3 years of pretending like everything was okay to untangle, and all the military's mental health stigma to untangle. And so that took years. It took years before I would say the words, I'm a disabled combat veteran, out loud. The first time I ever typed it in an anonymous chat group, I sat at my keyboard crying because I'd never put the words out into the world. And now it's one of the first things I will identify myself as. And so that has taken a long time, and a lot of those little steps and setbacks and trying different words and owning the story in different ways for it to become as comfortable as it is now.
So this question is not exactly on topic, so we may edit this out, but I'm just curious. There seems to be a real disconnect, and I don't have any familiarity with military culture at all, but between the sense that the people who come back or come out of the military are heroes and to be celebrated and honored and have special parking spots at Home Depot, and yet you can't, there's some sort of cultural thing about not being injured or disabled in combat. I would think it would have been the opposite, where people would be celebrated for that, and the whole bravery danger thing.
There is what are the words for it? There's kind of a continuum of an accepted level of being injured. So a veteran who comes home missing a limb, with a gunshot wound, with something you can see and say, they were in harm's way. And this is all unspoken, but this is how it plays out, is given kind of a higher standing in that hero macho guy who did the brave thing. Whereas for me specifically, I sustained what's called concussive injuries. There was no shrapnel, there was no blood. I separated my shoulder, I crushed some nerves in my left shoulder, elbow, and wrist. Later on, I was diagnosed with a brain injury. I think it was even 3 days after I got hurt, one of the doctors I was checking in with asked my friend if I was faking it for attention. And that has carried with me ever since, as a young female with 10 fingers and 10 toes, basically. how could I have actually been injured? And therefore my injuries aren't real enough. They don't count. It's for clout. It's very held against me in certain circles within the military that my injuries aren't sort of real enough. And so, yeah, there's this really weird, like unknown, undefinable threshold of like a real hero with real injuries who was in real combat, and all the rest of us who were in combat zones and have forever had our lives impacted by that.
Yeah. Wow. Totally foreign and fascinating in kind of a dark way distinction to me.
Yeah. Oh, and it's so hard. Like, I mean, even these were my best friends on deployment. We spent literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, living in very tight quarters, working incredibly long hours, literally depending on each other for our lives. And yet, like the minute we came home, they basically all turned their backs on me. And it's a weird, dark, and hard to understand world without living in the midst of it. And so for me, I walked away from it for a long time. I didn't even refer to the fact as a veteran. I didn't tell anybody that I went to Iraq. Like, I just went back to being a college kid. And so it took years for me to even say, oh yeah, I'm an Iraq veteran, or I'm a combat vet. Oh, I was disabled. I was wounded in combat. Like, all of that took years for me to come to terms with for myself.
Wow. And those people with whom you were so close in Iraq, were they not injured, or were they injured in the more like kind of macho bullet to the face way? And like, what was their?
Not injured. I still to this day have not figured out really what went wrong. I do have one friend, long story short, he and I were really close. Someone else in our company got hurt, and all of a sudden he stopped talking to me. And years later, we happened to be on a long car ride together. And he's like, yeah, when Aaron got hurt, I realized how fast I could lose any one of you. And I wasn't capable of handling that pain. So if I cut you out now, I can't be hurt if you get hurt later. And so it was this like preemptive, if I don't have friends, I can't get hurt if any of you get killed. Like, I can't, emotionally, I can protect myself. And so it's like, oh, that like, it's backwards and fucked up, but it made sense to me in a way. And I don't know what happened with the other guys, if they honestly think that I made up my injuries for attention and turned on me. I don't know if it was a similar emotional reaction where they were kind of like realized how serious that situation was and didn't know how to react to me anymore. I honestly don't know what happened.
Wow. Well, thanks for taking that side trip. Number two, there's no right way to do X, there's no right way to do anything. There's no
right way to do anything. There is this perception in our society that you graduate high school, you go to college, you get married, you buy a house, you have a baby, that a degree equals a career. If you look at kind of any major life decision you have to make, there's a process, there's an expected way that it's going to play out. Even something like, I follow a gal on TikTok who was widowed in her mid-30s, and people tell her she's too young to be a widow. Yet, like, here she is with a dead husband, like, not her choice. But the societal expectation runs so deep that once you get married, you're not a widow till you're 60, 70, 80. She couldn't possibly be a widow in her 30s. And so that it like there's no right way to come out of the closet and tell people that you're gay. There's no right way to have a marriage. There's no right way to build a family or not build a family. So there's just so many expectations. Even to circle back to what we were talking about earlier, like, how do you make that next step in owning your story? There's no right way to do it. Like, there are a million ways to do anything, and that is both a blessing and a curse. And so I encourage like curiosity and self-trust to explore all of the options, even the ones that you already know are off the table. Just explore it and then make decisions and know that that's right for you. But it might seem wrong to the rest of the world.
So part of what's going on here, if I understand correctly, is an interrogation and kind of self-awareness or self-reflection of the ways in which other people's values, social norms or cultural norms or parents or whatever, are influencing our decision making and what we consider as real options. Like when I finished high school, just because of my cultural background, I only had a couple of options of what I could do. And basically they involved going to Ivy League schools because otherwise it would have like destroyed my mom. And I'm lucky, like it worked out for me. but there was just there's so many other options that people might consider that it couldn't even entertain, because there was definitely like a right way to do something. And so in order to have that experience of there's no right way to do something, I have to have done this process of inquiry as to like, why do I have the beliefs that I have?
And I don't think there's anything wrong with flowing with the quote unquote right way that's been taught to us. Life, resources, whatever flowed in such a way that the college thing worked out for you. My husband and I we dated for years. We had a long engagement. We got married, but then we, moved in together, bought a house. Like we did everything in the like quote unquote right way. And I don't think there's anything wrong with flowing with that. I think questioning every decision all the time could put some people into a tailspin, but more so when we get into these pivotal life-changing moments, or when we realize we're not happy with the current situation, that's where you got to stop and look at like, why am I not happy? Oh, it's because society is telling me I'm 35 years old. I should have kids by now, or I should be married by now. Okay, how do I actually feel about marriage? Oh, this is really important to me. I should pursue it. Or, oh, actually, I don't give a shit. Like, how do I tell people in my life to back off? I don't want to get married, or, and so it's like, a lot of times you don't even realize you need to make these decisions till you get into that corner. And then it's that thing of, like I said, looking at all of the options. Like when my husband and I first started infertility treatments, the idea of ending that journey without children, unfathomable, not an option. Like we are going into this to get babies, period, end of story. And as our options started running out, and as we started kind of getting backed into this corner, it was like, okay, the options have changed. Adoption, surrogacy, childlessness. And I even remember, like, I absolutely won't pick childlessness, but for the sake of curiosity, for the sake of understanding my options, I'm going to at least explore it. Like, I remember laying in bed one night, like, who are all of the childless women I know, like, in their 40s and 50s, and like I have an aunt who never had kids. I have two aunts who didn't have their first kid till they were in their 40s, and I looked at all these people I know and I'm like, oh, they're happy. Their lives are fulfilled. Because we talk about childless women, like it's a very sad.
Oh yeah. I mean, we use the word barren.
Yes, exactly. It's this like
so intense.
It's the worst thing ever to end up a childless woman. And so I just had to even start by looking at like, what childless women do I know? And looking at the media, there's a lot of actresses, whether by choice or circumstance, who chose not to have kids. And then I went on Reddit and like, I found there's actually an entire subreddit about people who chose not to have, or who are childless after infertility. And I read their stories about how happy they are. And I was like, oh, this could be an option. And so then I actually was able to stack it up against the other options of adoption and surrogacy, and I could actually make a decision. And for some people, this childlessness is not the right option, and they continued to pursue other avenues. For us, adoption and surrogacy were not the right thing. We didn't even try. We just skipped over those to childlessness. And so that's that. There's no right way. I mean, there's a dozen ways for infertility treatments to end. You have to know all the options and which one's right for you.
Yeah, it seems like both of these first two have to do with emotional liberation. Like that's what I'm getting from this. Just like to be free of expectations, whether they're our own or other people's. It's almost like freedom from the past, like the ideas of the past.
Yes, very much. A lot of when I talk about like the pursuit of evolution, I say like change is inevitable, but evolution is optional. Like all of us, something's going to change at some point in our lives. And I watch so many people fight that change, and we joke about how hard change is, and change is hard, but like people make it like a badge of honor that they don't change. And then you just see how unhappy they are, or how life changes for them. And now they're just stuck in this I think of people who tragically lose a loved one unexpectedly. They're just stuck in this grief because they can't see outside of it. And it's like, okay, let's hold the grief. Let's make space for it. I'm not saying you don't get to grieve, but let's also look past it. And how do we evolve with that grief into the next thing in our life? And so, yeah, you can't even begin to look next until you let go of some stuff. And you have to be intentional about this looking forward and not worrying about the past so much. So yeah, there's this letting go thing that becomes crucial to even begin to fathom an evolution into what's next.
Yeah, I like how you put that. Okay, what about number 3?
All right, number 3 was embracing your strengths and balancing your weaknesses. Embracing your strengths, pretty straightforward. If there's something you're good at, lean into it. And I tend to focus on balancing your weaknesses because there's so much in the self-help culture that is about fixing your weaknesses. Screw that. You don't have to fix anything. Balance them. Find people and tools and resources that will help you manage things you're not great at. So in kind of a more literal sense, as I mentioned earlier, one of my injuries was a traumatic brain injury, which severely impacted my memory. Growing up, I had like a near photographic memory. It was obnoxious. It drove my mom batty. I would watch a movie once and I could like quote it back, characters, plots, subplots. Now I can watch a movie about 4 times before I remember how it's going to end. And so for me, like,
which is kind of an awesome superpower if it's a good movie.
It's super handy. Yeah.
You get to watch The Matrix for the first time 4 times.
Yes, exactly. I watch TV series over and over and over. And my husband's like, you've seen this episode before. I'm like, I know, I can't wait to see how it ends. But I used to hate it because for me, it was such a dramatic change. I didn't have to keep a calendar and a to-do list growing up. I just remembered that stuff. And so for me, that became a weakness that I used to beat myself up for. And I tried to fix it. And I read books on how to improve your memory. And like, that's not my problem. Like that part of my brain is damaged. And so instead of fighting it, I learned I have a whole system of calendars and to-do lists to keep me on track with my life. I have taught people in my life how to compensate for me. I've learned how to like ask for what works for me. So my mom and I, we talk every other Tuesday. And a lot of times when we're talking, she's like, oh, hey, can you search on Amazon for me for this thing? I'm like my mom's personal shopper. And while she's asking me, she will simultaneously email me a reminder of what she asked me. Because if you ask me in passing in conversation, I will forget by the time we get off the phone. And so she'll just email me while we're talking so that when we get off the phone, email pops up and I remember that I said I would do this thing for her.
Yeah. So I don't mean to diminish your traumatic brain injury, but there may be a part of this that also, I mean, speaking from my personal experience, has to do with aging. Because all of your examples, like I could really benefit from that as well.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny. It's one that I can very distinctly remember a before and after life where I had a memory versus what my memory is now. And that used to make me angry. And I had to own that story. And I'm able to articulate that difference. I would say my memory now is probably on par with a lot of people. Like I'm realizing that the way my brain works now is pretty average. But for me, it was such a dramatic change that I very consciously went and learned ways to deal with it. Like another example, I worked at a doctor's office and I was medical records clerk and I had 17 nurses that I answered to this was back in the day of paper charts. And so they would send me messages or I'd walk by and they'd be like, hey, when you get back to your office, can you grab so-and-so's chart? And I'd say, yeah, can you write that on a sticky for me? Because I'll forget by the time I walk back to my office. And it got to the point, I got them so trained, they wouldn't even look up from what they were doing. They would just hold up a sticky note with a name on it. Because if it's not on a sticky note, I'm not going to remember. And so instead of us having this exchange, will you please write that on a sticky note? Yeah, I'll write it down. Here you go. They just hold their hand out with a sticky note on it. And I'd walk by and grab the sticky note and read it and go grab the chart and bring it back. And I was able to teach people tools that helped me because I had to distinctly go learn those tools versus a lot of people who just have crappy memories or have kind of aged into it and like not realize that change is there. But yeah, it is, and not fighting it.
Exactly. And that's the theme, I think, is like not fighting it, not judging it, not wishing it were other than it is, but being like, all right, this is the reality. Like, how am I going to make this reality fun and wonderful?
Right. Right. And on a bigger scope, when it comes to kind of what we've talked about, so this bigger, heavier, navigating life-changing stuff, in grief, looking, there's no right answer. Maybe it's a therapist, maybe it's a best friend, maybe it's a life coach, maybe it's a death doula. There's all sorts of industries that we don't even realize of people who have tools that might help us. And so it's not like, for me with grief, I mean, my master's in mental health, I used to be a therapist. Like, I don't need a therapist to walk me through grieving. I need someone to sit with me while I sort a box of my loved one's stuff. And that's what a death doula does. And so it's like finding those people who can fill that particular weakness, an area that I'm struggling to navigate by myself, where I don't have the right tools or people to navigate.
I love it. And what I love so much about this is, to me, it's really the essence of community, both emotionally and economically. And, like there's, certain things that we like doing, that we're good at doing, that flow for us. There's other things that won't. And so that's like why we're not just alone.
Yeah, exactly. And there's just so much pressure to fix it. And I don't own your story, let go of it. Don't put that pressure on yourself. Like, there are people and tools out there who can do that thing for you. And I actually I learned about that one a lot in the business world. There's the whole zone of genius thing. And this is where that idea comes from. And I have a friend who talks about double down or hire out, is what my friend Kelly Deal calls it, is if it's a strength, double down on it. If it's a weakness, hire it out. And so a similar concept is let's not fight the weakness. Let's hire it out.
So that's awesome. Okay. So those are the first three, the mindset shifts. I would summarize them as having to do with acceptance and emotional liberation. And now we're getting to the middle chunk, these 4 practices. And by the way, this resonates with me so much how you've done this, because as part of our coaching program, we have this thing called the first principles. And they're these they're like this. They're just like little chunks of wisdom or practices or ways to see the world that oh, I could be doing that differently. And they're like little atomic pieces of software that you can kind of install and change how you live your life. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So the 4 practices.
Yes. So do you want me to hit them all again really quick?
Yeah.
Or just
great.
Okay.
Yeah. I love it.
Baby steps, boundaries, face it, and then quit more stuff.
Baby steps, boundaries, face it, and face it again.
Yeah.
And quit stuff. All right.
Yep.
So baby steps.
Right. Baby steps. So this actually, I 100% stole this idea. There is a late 80s, early 90s, I think it's actually early 90s movie called What About Bob? And it's Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss. It's terrible and hilarious at the same time. By today's standard, is the most ableist piece of mental health trash, but it's hilarious. So Bill Murray plays a guy with obsessive compulsive disorder. Richard Dreyfuss is his doctor. And as the doctor, has this book called Baby Steps. And so Bill Murray's character is learning to navigate the world with crippling OCD, and his doctor's saying baby steps. And so you see scenes of Bill Murray trying to open a door, and he's got a handkerchief in his hand, baby steps, baby steps, baby steps. And it's break it down smaller, break it down smaller, break it down smaller. And that is everything, whether you're navigating an emotional issue or a physical, how do I do this thing? So back when my PTSD was at its worst, I suffered with really severe depression, really severe anxiety, and I would lay in bed for days at a time. I didn't eat, I didn't do self-hygiene, I didn't sleep. I just sort of existed. And so early on, I set myself a rule that if I got out of bed, took a shower, and got back in bed, even if I put on the same dirty pajamas and crawled right back in bed, it would allow myself to count that day as a success. And that baby step of just taking a shower, A, it feels good. It does things for us mentally, emotionally, physically. But B, instead of saying, God, all I did today was shower, I could say, hey, I got a shower today. I am so taking life by the horns. I showered today. And so it allowed me to start creating these little measures of success, this little hit of dopamine, this little bit of I think it's basically conditioning that I could do this thing. And so from there, it was, okay, I'm going to take a shower and I'm going to put on jeans. Even if I crawl back in bed, I'm going to put on like real clothes, not pajamas. And that was a success. And then it got easy. And then it was like, okay, I'm going to go drive past Walmart. And after a couple weeks of showering, getting dressed, and going for a drive, then it became, okay, I'm going to go to Walmart at 3 a.m. because there's nobody there and I don't have to deal with crowds. I can wander the store, do my shopping. And all of these little steps finally built up to being able to just go back to the grocery store and shop like anybody else on a regular day, regardless of the crowds. And so no matter how big the thing is, how small of a marker of success can we create today and do that? And if it feels too big, break it down further.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like you're setting up the game so that it's winnable.
Yeah.
By you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. When they talk about training dogs, there's a modality of dog training that is that you want your dog to always succeed. Like you're never going to set them up for, say, like a recall, calling them back to you. You don't do it unless you know they're going to succeed at it in the beginning. So even if they're only 2 feet away from you, you'll still call them back because you know they'll succeed at closing that 2-foot gap. Because then the dog's going to fail and it complicates things and everybody feels bad. But if we have, even if it's a 1-foot recall and it's successful again and again and again, that translates into bigger and better things. And so, yeah, that translates to human brains just as efficiently.
That's my dream as a parent, to do that. It's totally not what I do, but I wish I did. Yeah, no, it's just so clear how that would be so much better for everybody.
Yeah. And this can go with emotional stuff too. It gets more complicated. This kind of is that owning your story that we talked about, is sometimes dealing with the emotional thing is first in a very private matter and then starting to talk about it elsewhere. And this is also where it gets complicated. So like baby steps can also tie into boundaries pretty heavily. So I was very open about our infertility story. And a lot of people are not. They don't even tell their family that they're going through infertility treatment, which is crazy because a lot of infertility treatment, like there was points where I had like 4 doctor's appointments a week, and I have somewhere between 3 and 8 shots, medical injections daily, and like hiding this from family. And so like the baby step
rather than getting support from your family.
Yes, exactly. And so for some people, for a myriad of reasons, don't want to tell their family what's going on. And so sometimes this is where boundaries ties in, is that the baby step is tell your family that you're going through medical treatments. The boundary is they don't get asked questions. And so then we have to dive into boundaries. But like sometimes baby steps tie into, okay, I need to tell this person, I need to tell my boss that my husband has cancer, but I don't have the capacity to talk in detail about his cancer, about his prognosis, whatever. And so the boundary is, hey, you need to know this is going on in my life. It might impact my work. I might have to be out. I'm sorry if you catch me at my desk crying, but I'm also not ready to talk about it beyond that. And so baby steps and boundaries a lot of times kind of drag one into the other to be able to do the baby step. We need some boundaries.
Yeah. That makes sense. So let's shift over to boundaries, because I think the baby steps thing is just so clear. It's like setting up games that we can win.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So boundaries, like I feel like this is getting to be a more common topic in society, so I don't have to explain it much, but that's that thing of like boundaries are, this is the thing I like to clarify. Boundaries are the rules and limitations and guidelines for ourselves, not for the people around us. So I actually misworded this a minute ago. I can't tell my mom she can't ask me about infertility treatments. I can tell my mom that I will not discuss my infertility treatments.
Right.
And she can ask all she wants.
And then you have power, you have ownership over it. You're not trying to enforce something you don't have control over.
Right. Because a lot of times the conversation when I talk about boundaries, people are like, oh, my mom just steamrolls my boundaries. You can't change you can't change anyone else's behavior. So the boundary is, here's what I'm comfortable with. Here's what I'm willing to acknowledge. Here's what I'm willing to do when it comes to time. Ankur, I'll come on your podcast, but I only can talk for 45 minutes. It's up to you whether you or not you want me still on your show. And if you say yeah, and we hit 45 minutes and you keep pestering me, it's up to me to say, hey, I gave you the heads up. I got to go. Thank you for a great show. Bye. So like, yeah, it's giving us that power, which obviously I have all the time in the world. We're good. That was just for whatever reason. That's what popped in my head today. But it's giving us that power of stating where we're at with things. And to navigate a lot of life-changing things, we need to also know what our boundaries are for how much we're willing to tell people, how much time we're willing to give people, when and where and how we need to take space for ourselves. When I travel with family, because of my neurodivergence, it gets very overwhelming for my brain. I take an hour usually every afternoon that I need everybody to leave me alone. And so I need to go somewhere quiet or go for a walk by myself. And now my family, now it's just like built in how we plan stuff. But it was a boundary I had to set that, like, if you want me to stay pleasant and enjoyable, I need a break from you to let my brain kind of decompress. Otherwise, I'm going to get tired and grumpy and nobody's going to want me around. So like, I realized that, I put the boundary in place, I do the thing, and everybody's happier for it.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So the next one was face it and face it again.
Yeah. And so I used to say fake it till you make it. When I originally started working on this kind of framework, it was fake it till you make it. But there's a lot of negative connotation around that saying, of like implying that you should stuff your emotions and pretend to be happy. And I want the exact opposite of that. I want you to face those emotions. I want you to face those things that happened. This is kind of part of owning your story, is coming back to these things that are going on in your life and talking about them, looking at the options, looking at all the options, looking at them repeatedly. At day one of our infertility treatments, childless was not an option. I faced that decision again and again and again until it became even somewhat okay feeling, let alone actually having to make that decision. And so I think, especially as we interact with other people, we don't communicate enough. There are too many subjects that we don't want to talk about, that we shouldn't talk about, that we have guilt and shame and fear about. And if we over communicate and we start facing these things and talking about them with the people around us, either that thing is so much less scary and or we have so much more support. And so facing it helps take that power away from it, puts the power back on our side, and helps us to navigate all these things.
Is it kind of similar to the first one about exposure?
Yep. And also looking at it from all the different facets, it goes kind of this next level of like, so a lot of times when we're navigating change, I've talked about how people don't want to make change. By not making a choice, you're making a choice. And so often that's the choice we don't want. And that's why we don't make the decision, but that rarely works out in our favor. And so by facing it and talking about it and working our way through it, it allows us to make an actual decision for ourselves. And so it gives us that power back. And also then all the time, nothing in our life is simple. Like I talk about grief, and I have buried too many friends under the age of 45, and I've been to too many funerals. And I have also learned to sit at a funeral and tell stories about that person and laugh, because that's who that person was in my life. And so when we slow down and we face it again, instead of just the overwhelming grief, I'm thinking of a particular friend, of the overwhelming grief and shock of Stuart's death, I could kind of see that and hold that, but also step back and in the back of the room with my friends, tell our favorite stories about Stuart and laugh and joke, because that's who he was in our lives. But if I don't face the grief, I never have space for those good stories again. If I don't face the flip side of that, my dad died. He drank himself to death, essentially. The last 7 years of his life, I had no contact with him. The first 20 some years, I was a daddy's girl. And so when he died, I had intensely conflicting emotions, because I grew up being a daddy's girl, but I was also so mad at this man that drank himself to death. And I had to face all of those and find a way to process them all together. And so like at one point, I actually went on Facebook. A lot of my friends, my dad and I used to do martial arts together, and a lot of my friends knew my dad as well. And I said, here's the deal, guys. My dad made some bad decisions, and I'm really stuck in the anger of that. will you all tell me your favorite story of my dad? And I got, I don't know, 15 or 20 just funny stories, beautiful stories, friends, people I knew mutually of doing Aikido with my dad and training stories from Saturday morning training sessions. And the one time that my dad stopped by on somebody's birthday and they didn't think he would come. They weren't even going to invite him to the party. And my dad still stopped. My dad's not a social guy. And he still stopped by. And I got all these beautiful stories. And in the moment, I was so angry that was their memories. And I was just lost in my dad drank himself to death and never apologized to me for ruining our family as an alcoholic. But I kept coming back to those stories. And now I can read them and go, oh, yeah, there was a really good guy in there who happened to be an addict. And by facing it again and again, I can now carry both of those. And I can fondly remember my daddy. And I can also be really mad at this alcoholic and glad he's gone. But if I didn't keep coming back to it, and if I didn't open myself up to it, I never would be able to work through all of that giant conflicting emotion.
Wow. What a powerful example. And I can't believe, I don't do much with social media, and I have some aversion. I'm amazed that you were able to use that platform for such a deep emotional healing, like this, to get these stories that then you'd have to face over and over again.
Yeah. I have a lot of feelings about social media too, but it was just one of those, like, I'm going to take a chance on this and throw it out there. And also, like, with that comes anytime you, like, because for a lot of us, social media is so prevalent, like anytime you put yourself out there like that, there is also this component. There were several comments from people who didn't know my dad, but felt like they needed to kind of interject themselves in this thing I was doing, that I just had to let that go. And that comes back to the boundary that I put for myself, was that those weren't the people I was there to talk to. So those were the comments I ignored. And I am the first to delete and block on social media because it is what I curate it to be. And so boundary that I put in place all the time is, controlling how social media plays into these things that I'm going through.
And then what was the fourth one?
The fourth one is quit more stuff.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we kind of talked about this when I said in the infertility thing, there's so much pressure to not quit. And yet that was the best thing I ever did when we made the decision that, and here's me tying all of these steps together. Here's a real life example of how this stuff plays out. My husband and I went into our last couple rounds of IVF knowing we were basically out of options, that we weren't going to have a biological child, like that it was adoption, surrogacy, or childlessness. We were coming up on that option, but we were talking about it, baby steps. We were talking about it, little conversations. Like my mom would call and I'd be like, she lived 2 hours away. And I'd be like, sure, I can come up this afternoon. If I had a baby, I couldn't do that. Here's this little baby step, face it again moment of like, oh, if I have kids, I can't do this thing. But if I'm childless, this thing's still really easy to do. And then we pull right back out of that conversation and I go on with life. And so we go through this couple years of all of this stuff. And when we had our last miscarriage, we knew we were done. Like we'd made all the decisions. If this last pregnancy doesn't work, we're going to move on childless. And when I woke up, I had to have a D&C. The miscarriage needed medical help. And when I woke up, I felt relief because I finally had an answer. And I then went on to cry for the next 6 months in grief because I would never have kids. I wouldn't get to see my husband be a father. It wasn't about that. It was about having that answer. It was about quitting this thing that was ruining my life. My life was in limbo while we were in infertility treatments. And I see this in a million ways. I have a friend who we just recently were talking. She doesn't love her job and she's kind of thinking about changing careers, but she's like, but I'm 40 and have a master's degree in this thing. Like, I'm stuck with it. So the look on your face, like obviously, like listeners can't hear it, but like exactly, like if you're not happy, quit the thing. I have a master's degree. I spent 2 years in that field and moved on because I realized that field wasn't right for me. And there's no right way to do anything. Maybe you spend 20 years in the field and then move on. Maybe you spend 2 years in the field. Maybe you don't finish the degree if you're, like there's just this pressure of once you commit to a thing, you're stuck with it forever.
Yeah, it's like this prison, in my mind, it keeps coming like liberation, the prison of the past, of our past beliefs, our decisions, the values that we got, but then we're not able to be ourselves in this moment.
Yes. And quitting things can also be quitting people. Like there are friends that I wish no ill will to, but they no longer fit in my life. So I don't feel a sense of obligation to keep up with them. And I used to feel guilty because like once you're a best friend, you're a friend forever kind of thing. But that didn't work for me with this person. And so I let them go. This can be family members' boundaries that are toxic. Sometimes you need to quit people and get them out of your life for your own safety, health, well-being. This can be a conversation they see a lot in a lot of communities, in chronic illness, in neurodivergence, and LGBTQ community, is we get one label. And then as time goes on, the label changes. And people are like there's kind of a conversation. I'll pick one of those communities as an example. Like in the LGBTQ community, you'll see sometimes somebody comes out as queer and they don't know if they're gay or bi or pan. So they just use a big label of queer. And if queer doesn't keep working for you, quit the label queer and pick the label bi. Or if she, they pronouns don't work, quit that and pick they, them pronouns. Like nothing has to be permanent. So quit it. If the marriage, another example, I have a friend who was not unhappy in her marriage, but not happy. And she asked her husband about it. He's like, yeah, I think you're neat, but I'm not really in love with you anymore. And she was like, cool, me neither. And they got divorced. And everybody was like, what went wrong? Did he cheat on you? Oh my gosh, like, did he hit you? She's like, no, we just grew up and we fell out of love. And he's going to go do his own thing now. And it was like, there's no right way to do everything. Everybody was blown away that she got divorced, even though nothing was quote unquote wrong. But it wasn't fulfilling anymore. So quit it. And so like, there's just everywhere in life, I just see us hold on to things because we're supposed to, or because we're not quite sure what the next option is. Like quit. If it doesn't feed you, if it doesn't fulfill you, if it doesn't help you grow, quit.
Wow. I almost want that to be kind of like a song.
And I was like, I need to like write that down and put it on a t-shirt or something.
Yeah, maybe like a hip hop song or something. All right. Yeah. Yeah. And I love it. It's like totally on theme in terms of liberation. And it reminds me of this quote from Gandhi, who's one of my personal heroes, where he says, if you're reading my writing or you're listening to my talks and there's two things that contradict each other, just choose the latter one. Because I'm always growing, I'm always evolving, I'm learning, and there's plenty of things I said 20, 30 years ago that I just don't believe anymore. And they were my best effort at the time, and they were part of this path of growth and evolution.
Yeah, exactly. It's this constant thing. And to quit it doesn't mean to kind of take that one step further. It doesn't mean to be afraid of it or shy away from it. He said, if you read the two things, like pick the latter. Like, it's not that one is bad or wrong. There are people in the infertility community who feel a lot of guilt about how much money they put into treatments to only quit and walk away without children. Irrelevant. Like quitting, I can also, flip side of that same conversation, I can still also have a lot of grief about not having kids, but I can quit and know that was the right decision and be happy about my future and hold the grief. Yeah.
Okay. So we've done the 3 mindset shifts. We've done the 4 actions or practices. And now we're going to tie it together with just kind of the fractal overview, the eighth pillar.
The 8th pillar is the never stop learning and growing. All of this, like we've touched on, it's a constant evolution. It's a constant practice. One time somebody asked me, it's been 18 years since I was wounded in combat. And people, and I've spent, 12 or 15 years of that in therapy. And people kind of ask, well, are you better yet? Like, when are you going to be done with that? And it's like, no, like I've had a dozen different therapists, and they teach me different tools at different stages. What my most recent therapist and I talk about and work on, I could not even comprehend on the first day I walked into therapy. And on the first day I walked into therapy, that level of like care and tools we were working on, I don't really need anymore because I'm fairly well managed in living with my PTSD. And so there's this like revisiting all of these steps and pillars that we talked about is this ongoing thing we need to keep doing. And we keep adding new tools and we meet new people and we learn new resources and our belief systems change and our lives change. And so, yeah, it's this never ending. When you get stuck, go back to baby steps, figure out which step you're on, and then look at all the rest of these parts and pieces and start the next evolution.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. This has been I've never done an episode like this before. Usually they're just straight interviews. Often I'm trying to figure out something about vision and purpose, either in that person's future or how they got to where they are. And I'm averse to opinions. Like I want to hear people's stories, not what they think about shit. So it's very different. This is like your rules on how to live, but they're just so grounded in your experience. And I just love like where you're coming from with each one of these things, that it felt right. It's a total experiment. It's part of the evolutionary process of this podcast. But I really appreciate your time. You're being so frank, so honest, so vulnerable, so present. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on and letting me explore this. Even as I talk about it again, I have little new realizations for myself. This is the power of owning your story. Every time I talk about it, I'm like, ooh, I had never actually really thought about that story with my dad in that context. Like, that was pretty great. So it's still healing to me. And like, if it makes you feel better in the context of your podcast, like this is all very formal and like on paper now, and I can teach it like this. But when I look back at how I navigated Iraq and the years right after Iraq, this is my story. This is what I was unconsciously doing. And I didn't realize it at the time, but now I look back on it. And as I interview people for my shows, a lot of these things I think we're inherently drawn to. Speed that up. I want to help us intentionally navigate that, not spend 5, 10, 15 years bouncing around in grief and depression and overwhelm and burnout. Like, you still have to do all the work, but here's a little map that might help you get through it a little faster.
Yeah. Beautiful. And just maybe we could wrap with that. If you just want to give a shout out to your show or any other resources you have that people, we'll put it in the show notes for sure, but just to hear it in your own.
Yeah. If you want to hear more of these stories and resources, my podcast is called The Pursuit of Evolution. Jump over and give that a follow. And then I love continuing the conversation. Like, this to me is a dialogue starter, not the end of the conversation. So you can go to CaseyJordan.com/next. And there's 3 ways there to get in touch with me and keep this conversation going.
Fantastic. Thank you, Casey. That concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes podcast. Your hosts are Ankur Shah and Nathan Ramos. Let's roll out of here with some gratitude. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to our guest, Casey Jourdan, for your inspiration. Thanks to Pierre for the awesome show artwork. And thanks to DJ Plainview for the theme music. Thank you to our audio editor and producer, Martine. And to everybody out there, if you like the show and you want to support our mission, support our growth, there's 2 things you can do. There's many things, but let's start with 2. The main one is to reach out and let us know how the show has contributed to your life and how our show could contribute to your life even further. Do you get what we're trying to do? And I want to know. And once you've done that, the next best thing is to share the episodes that have touched you with people who they will also touch. It's that simple. Share the love and take good care.